Hello, my name is Chloe Arthid. Today I will be presenting on child labor in England. During this presentation, I will be covering the following topics: pre-industrial child labor during the Industrial Revolution, why would children work, the nonprofit organizations that assisted, the working conditions of children, health impacts from child labor, and the uprising and abolition of child labor. In pre-industrial England, children still worked, but not in the same way. They were often working for their parents, like on a farm in agriculture or in a shop as an apprentice. Girls historically worked at home with their mothers, conducting maid labor, washing clothes, and cooking. The children who did find training apprenticeships outside their family always took them to learn the trade. This was usually counted as a full education. Because of the increase in steam and coal technology, the factory came into being. With that came a massive shift towards industrializing to meet population demands. Coal was needed for heat and other things across the nation and the world, which in turn increased the demand for mining. The innovations of technology brought mass development and industrial production. Many textile mills were built along with new mines and machines to expedite work. Unfortunately, children filled the niche in the workforce very well. During the time, manual labor was thought to be resistant to discipline, monotony, and the fast-paced machine work. Management within centralized production was a new concept to be tested. There were new ideas and technologies that were now beginning to be used on children. The labor of children was extremely cheap to pay for. They required no more than pennies. In the late 18th century, children from the ages of 5 to 14 made up 20% of England's population. As population and the economy grew exponentially, the old system could no longer sustain children to not work. The youth was perfectly suited to work in the small factory spaces and with the tiny mechanical parts. Child labor helped greatly push the economy and were therefore needed to work. John Locke even stated, "Idle children was labor lost to society." One of the biggest reasons children worked was to provide for their family. Children supplied around 13% of a family's house income between 1787 and 1796. The age that was working the most was still the older children, but the second age group from 13 to 15 made up a close second at 17.4%. I was surprised to see that in other countries like Paraguay, a much higher contribution to the family was made by children. During the 18th century, while child labor was at its peak, nonprofits like churches and health foundations played a huge role. One was Christ's Hospital. It was a school for kids around 8 to 9 years old to earn an apprenticeship. Churches were especially good for impoverished children because children on their own, with only their families, did not have very many connections or opportunities. Churches, however, had a wide spider web of connections and provided many opportunities for apprenticeships. This helped a lot of children find good places to work with better working conditions. Many children became parish apprentices, which was close to an indentured servant. The children were just too poor to not work for somebody. The majority of boys worked in manufacturing. This was mostly in mills and factories, whereas most of the female children workers were in domestic services, doing things like housekeeping, sewing, or other maid labors. Children worked in less than ideal conditions for any human being. They were often very hot from the thermal energy given off by machine labor. Long 15-hour workdays were also very common. The conditions that they worked in were, however, often dangerous. Children working in a textile mill were often rushing to meet the demand from the machines. If they had not replaced the spindle before it was started, their fingers would be caught in the spinning machine. Child labor was also used in the coal mines to travel through small, poorly ventilated tunnels with large carts full of coal. Clearly, healthy working conditions were not a concern. The health impacts from child labor were not super noticeable at the time. Many children were severely deprived of needed breaks and nutrients. Oftentimes, at dinner, they were required to clean the machinery, and lunch breaks were not common practice. Even when they were allowed a break to eat, the food was hardly sustenance. This resulted in slow, malnourished children. As time went on, they realized that well-fed children were happier and more eager to work than starving ones. So factories began to feed their children while at work and increased production loads. One child was too sick to walk to work, but was instead carried to work for his usual shift at the mill. At another, a number of employers agreed that working through the night was needed for the business's profitability. So they worked their children through the night as if it was not bad for small children. All this deprivation resulted in a smaller stature of men at the time. It was a very challenging issue in the late 1700s to early 1800s to abolish child labor. The economic benefits that children provided for the nation seemed to outweigh the disparities of child labor. Through child labor, kids were able to work for money, to gain an education in a trade, rather than being forced to simply go to school for no money. Although there were horror stories of abuse in the factories overall, the consensus is that the issues were isolated and rare. It was said that abolishment wouldn't end child abuse. In addition, the government was hesitant to interfere with the freedom of people to work and the agreements that are made between employers and employees on wages and working conditions. This was because the poverty was so high that families needed the income from their children, although child labor was synonymous with slavery. In 1802, the first Factory Act was passed, although it only applied to orphans 12 years of age and under, mostly because that was the most common abused demographic. The act, however, wasn't enforced until 1833, and only then did the government implement inspectors for the factories and other workplaces. They also limited the number of hours that could be worked per week down to 48 hours. These changes signaled an improvement in working conditions for the first time. In 1870, an Education Act was passed, in which required elementary education for every child. This caused a huge rise in literacy rates along with increased economic mobility for the working class. This act also established formal teaching qualifications for government-supported schools.